The knee came down between her shoulder blades without warning. One moment she was standing in her own hallway, hands raised, blinking against the blinding white of 30 flashlights aimed at her face. The next, the floor was rising to meet her, and her cheek hit the hardwood with a sound she would carry for a long time. Flat, hard, final. The sound of a body being put somewhere it had no business being. Her arms were wrenched behind her back before she drew a full breath. Steel cuffs clicked shut so fast and so tight, the metal bit skin before the ratcheting sound finished echoing. She lay still, completely still. Not because she was afraid, because she was already working. Boots moved in every direction. Radios crackled over each other. Someone shouted from the kitchen. Someone answered from down the hall. The helicopter overhead, the one that had pulled her from dead sleep 6 minutes ago, was still circling, its rotors thudding through the walls and the floorboards and the bones of her chest, like something that had always been there and intended to stay. She turned her face slightly against the hardwood. Her reading glasses were 3 feet away, one lens intact, the other cracked clean from center to rim, catching the sweep of a flashlight beam that moved past and kept going. She had heard the boot come down on them, above all the chaos, a single small precise sound like punctuation on a sentence she hadn't written. She said, clearly and without any particular urgency, "You have the wrong address. This is 317. Check the warrant. The address on your warrant is 315. A man crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell spearmint gum. His voice carried the practiced boredom of someone who has heard every version of this particular sentence. "Sweetheart, every person on this floor in every house I've ever hit has got the same story. Yours isn't special." He stood up. He stepped over her like she was a threshold. "Fan out," he said. "Every room. Everything locked. You break it. Everything sealed, you cut it. I want this house turned inside out." She did not scream. She did not cry. She pressed her cheek against the floor she had refinished herself plank by plank 2 summers ago. And she closed her eyes, and she began to count. Not seconds. Violations. Each one named and cataloged in the precise ordered mind that had spent 20 years inside federal courtrooms. Wrong address. No warrant presented. No rights read. Physical restraint without probable cause. Handcuffs applied past any humane standard. She was building a case. She had been building cases her entire adult life. She could wait. 5:48 a.m. A Saturday. Dellwood, Mississippi. 30 officers. 2 matte black SWAT trucks. 12 patrol cars. A helicopter. A battering ram. All of it aimed at one woman in sleep clothes on a quiet residential block where the biggest sound most mornings was a neighbor's sprinkler cutting on at dawn. By morning, the Department of Justice would be activated. By noon, the footage would be national. And when Chief Roland Vickers arrived, uniform half-tucked, driving like the city was burning, and walked through that shattered doorway and turned the corner into the living room and saw what was hanging on the wall behind the reading chair, he would go the color of paper. Not gradually, all at once, like someone pulled the plug. The kitchen light at 317 Sycamore Lane had been on since 10 o'clock the night before. Vivienne Moss was 44 years old. She was sitting at her kitchen table in an old Spelman College sweatshirt that had been washed enough times that the letters were ghosting, and a pair of reading glasses taped at the left hinge, which she had been meaning to fix for 3 months. Her hair was pulled back in a bun that had mostly surrendered since around midnight. A mug of chamomile tea sat at her elbow, cold for 2 hours and forgotten entirely. She was reading complaint files, not policy briefs, not the carefully worded memos that required responses in the diplomatic precision that distinguished federal bureaucracy from human communication. Complaint files. Real ones, some handwritten in the careful cursive of people who had sat down at tables not so different from this one, and tried to put into words what had been done to them, a family in Alabama. Door beaten down at 4 a.m. on an anonymous tip that turned out to be a neighbor's grudge. A single transposed digit on a warrant. 2 small children watching their father put face down in his own living room, while officers moved through the house and found nothing. They filed a complaint. 6 months later, a form letter. No evidence of procedural misconduct. A 23-year-old woman in Georgia pulled from her car during a traffic stop that escalated in under 90 seconds into a warrantless search because an officer didn't like the way she answered a question. She filed a complaint. Marked reviewed. Nothing changed. File after file. 5 states. Dozens of families. The same pattern in different handwriting from different addresses in different years, arriving always at the same place. Doors kicked in. People pressed into floors. Complaints filed. Complaints buried. This was Vivienne's work. She was Senior Enforcement Counsel at the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Before that, 8 years as a federal appellate judge, appointed to the Fifth Circuit at 36 youngest in the circuit's history, one of a very small number of black women to hold that seat. She had clerked for a Supreme Court justice. She had argued cases that became casebook standards. She had spent her entire career in one form or another, making the law mean something for people who needed it to mean something. She was exceptionally good at it. She picked up her phone, called her aunt in Gulfport. 2 rings. Then the warm, immediate voice of someone who answers before they're fully awake, because some habits outlast sleep. Vivienne Louise. It is past midnight. I know, Auntie. You're still at that table. Just finishing. A sound that was equal parts disapproval and love. That work will be there in the morning. You go to bed. Going right now. She was already smiling. Yes, ma'am. She stacked the files neatly, the way she did everything, and slid them into the worn brown leather briefcase on the chair beside her. She rinsed her mug, locked the front door, checked it twice, old habit, from years that had left their mark, and blew out the cinnamon candle on the counter. On her way to the bedroom, she passed through the living room in the dark. She knew the room by feel the exact distance from the doorway to the hallway entrance, the slight raise of the rug's edge near the reading lamp, the 3 steps between the armchair and the wall behind it. She passed the wall without stopping, turned off the light. Everything on it disappeared into darkness. In the dark, you couldn't see any of it, but it was there. At the center, a certificate of federal appellate appointment to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Formal letterhead. The language of a country formally acknowledging what one of its citizens had built. At the bottom, 2 signatures. The Chief Justice and the President of the United States, in the bold, particular cursive of a man who had signed thousands of documents and meant every one. Below them, in clean, formal type, Vivienne Moss. To the left, a DOJ Senior Enforcement Counsel credential. Gold federal seal in the lower corner. Her photograph taken on her first day in the roll-dark blazer, direct gaze the composed expression of someone photographed in an official capacity. Her name. Her title. The words, United States Department of Justice in the institutional blue that appeared on every piece of federal identification she had ever carried. Above the credential, a letter of commendation from the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, recognizing her contributions to a multi-year civil rights investigation that had produced the largest police accountability settlement in Mississippi's history. The letter used the words exceptional and indispensable in consecutive sentences. That was not normal in FBI correspondence. To the right of the center, a photograph. 8 by 10. Black frame. Vivien standing in a hallway that anyone who watched federal news would recognize the flags, the architecture, the particular quality of the light. The West Wing of the White House. She was shaking hands with the United States Attorney General. Both of them were smiling. Not a diplomatic half-smile, a real one caught mid-moment by a camera that happened to be there. At the bottom, in the smallest frame, her law degree from Howard University School of Law. The one she had carried home rolled in a cardboard tube on a Greyhound bus because she couldn't afford to fly, and she wanted her aunt to see it before she did anything else with it. She hadn't put any of this on the wall to make an impression. Most guests never noticed it. The wall was for her for Sunday mornings, with coffee sitting in the armchair when she needed to remember how far a girl from Gulfport could go if she refused year after year and setback after setback to stop. She set her alarm for 8 a.m. She was going to sleep in for once in her life. She pulled the covers to her chin. The house went quiet refrigerator hum, hallway clock. A dog barking somewhere far down the block, muffled and harmless and ordinary. Peace. Sycamore Hill had been a proud black community for more than 50 years. It sat on Dellwood's eastern edge, a mid-sized Mississippi city where old barber shops still occupied their original storefronts, and new coffee places were showing up on corners that used to hold hardware stores, and for sale signs had been appearing on porches that had been in the same families since the 1970s. The city was changing the way all cities changed, sometimes forward, sometimes sideways. But Sycamore Hill had held. Teachers lived here, nurses, retired postal workers, deacons who had attended the same church on Birchwood Avenue for 40 years, women who had raised their children here and were now raising grandchildren here, watching them ride bikes down the same stretch of sidewalk that had been worn smooth by 50 years of feet. Vivien had bought her a brownstone at 317 Sycamore Lane 12 years ago. She had scraped together a down payment over 4 years of deliberate frugality. No vacations, modest lunches, a 10-year-old car she ran until it quit. She had wanted to live here specifically, not a newer development on the north end, not the mid-rise condos going up near downtown. Here, on this block, in this neighborhood near people she understood, and who understood her. She knew every name on every porch. She knew Dara Simmons across the street, retired school librarian wind chimes on the porch, who waved to Vivien every single evening without fail, with the comfortable ease of two women who had chosen the same block and were glad of it. She knew Earl Watson 4 doors down, retired mail carrier, 32 years on Eastern Dellwood's routes, who spent his mornings on his porch with coffee and a commentary on the news that was sharp and frequently correct. But Sycamore Hill had a problem. The Dellwood Police Department had been in the local news for the better part of a year. Aggressive stop and frisk targeting young black men. A wrongful arrest lawsuit settled quietly with a confidentiality clause so tight the family couldn't name the amount. Complaints from residents about officers treating Sycamore Hill like occupied territory, rolling through in convoys at odd hours, running plates on every car that looked too new, questioning people for the offense of walking to the corner store after dark. Vivien knew all of it. She had read the reports at her DOJ desk. She had assembled a preliminary pattern and practice file on the Dellwood Police Department 6 months ago and flagged it for potential federal review. She had looked at the stop rates, the complaint rates, the internal affairs dismissal rates, and she had written in careful federal language that the numbers suggested a department that had developed a deeply ingrained set of practices bearing no relationship to documented crime, and a very strong relationship to the race of the people being policed. She had written that file. She had read those complaints. She had never imagined she would become one. At 317 Sycamore Lane, Vivienne Moss slept. The house was dark and still. It wouldn't stay that way. 5:48 a.m. 3 blocks east, in the cracked asphalt lot of a shuttered Texaco, where the pumps had been removed and the signage had faded to near nothing, a convoy was assembling with the quiet efficiency of a military operation. 12 patrol cars, 2 matte black SWAT trucks, engines idling low and patient, 1 unmarked command SUV, a helicopter already up, already circling spotlights, sweeping rooftops in long, searching arcs. 30 officers in body armor under the yellow buzz of the lot's one functioning streetlight. Helmets, Rifles checked. Flashbangs clipped to belts. A German shepherd near the rear truck reading the tension in the air, the way dogs do, ears forward, weight. Forward, every muscle calibrated to the fact that something was about to happen. The battering ram sat propped against the lead SWAT truck. 2 officers would swing it. They had done this enough times to stop discussing positioning. Lieutenant Dale Pruitt stood at the hood of the command SUV, a printed aerial map spread flat under his flashlight. Late 40s white, built like a man who had been physically imposing in his youth, and had maintained the shape without maintaining the conditioning. Wide shoulders, thick jaw, buzz cut going gray at the temples. He was working a piece of spearmint gum, and a toothpick sat behind his ear, a habit so old he no longer knew he was doing it. He pressed a finger to the map. Listen up. Not loud. He had given enough briefings to know how to fill a space with authority without raising his voice. Anonymous tip came in yesterday afternoon. Stash house. Single residential address. Sycamore Lane. Large quantity. Source is credible. This individual has given us solid intelligence before. He looked around at 30 faces. You know how these blocks are. We go in hard. Nobody hesitates. Anyone moves wrong, ground them first and sort it out after. He straightened up and looked them over. The way a man does when he has already decided how the morning ends and just needs his team to confirm they agree. Questions. Nobody spoke. Officer Sandra Marsh sat in the passenger seat of the command SUV, adjusting her vest straps. White early 30s blonde hair tight under her helmet. 3 years in Pruitt's unit. She had come up through the department believing the work mattered, that policing done right kept people safe and held something important in place. 3 years with Pruitt had layered other things on top of that belief. The habit of not asking the question that would slow things down. The understanding that commendations and operational opportunities came from compliance, and that compliance meant following Pruitt, and that following Pruitt meant the morning moved forward. She glanced at the warrant on the dashboard tablet. The address read 315 Sycamore Lane. She didn't double-check it against the aerial map. Neither did anyone else. Pruitt slapped the SUV hood twice. The engines around him shifted from idle to engaged. The convoy rolled. No sirens, just the silent pulse of red and blue lights sweeping across the darkened faces of sleeping houses as 12 patrol cars and 2 SWAT trucks moved through the empty streets of Dellwood toward Sycamore Hill. 6:03 a.m. The convoy turned onto Sycamore Lane and the block transformed. The helicopter dropped lower. Its spotlights carved through the gray pre-dawn in wide passes that lit rooftops and parked cars and dew-wet grass in harsh clinical white. The sound of the rotors dropped in pitch as the aircraft descended, that low, rhythmic thudding that you feel in the sternum as much as hear with the ears. Dogs began barking. First 1, then 2, then a chorus from 3 directions. The animal alarm of a neighborhood invaded by noise and light, and something none of them could name, but all of them could feel. Curtains moved. Lights flickered on. A child started crying somewhere down the block. 30 officers poured from their vehicles and moved to surround the house in the practiced, choreographed pattern of a unit that had done this many times in many places. Every window covered, every door blocked, every possible exit sealed. A 2-man sniper team moved to the roof of the house across the street, setting up with the unhurried precision of people executing a rehearsed plan. The house they surrounded was 317 Sycamore Lane, not 315, 317. The brass numbers were screwed into the porch post at eye level, catching the glow of the nearest street lamp, clearly enough to read from 6 feet away without squinting. 3, 1, 7. 2 of the digits matched the warrant address. 1 did not, the first one, the critical one, the one that placed them 2 houses away from where they were supposed to be. Nobody looked, nobody checked, because Pruitt didn't look. And if Pruitt didn't look, the operation moved forward. That was the arrangement. The lieutenant set the direction was maintained, until the lieutenant said otherwise, and Pruitt had not become the department's most decorated tactical commander by stopping on porches to read house numbers in the dark. He walked up the front steps. He stepped past the brass numbers without a glance. He stepped directly onto the welcome mat. Justice is not an accident. It lives here. And he didn't read that either, because he was already raising the megaphone. Open this door now, or we're coming through. You've got 30 seconds. His voice cracked through the silence of the entire block like a fist through paper. The helicopter hovered directly overhead. The spotlights locked. Inside 317, Vivienne Moss's eyes snapped open. The battering ram hit the front door at 6:05 a.m., and the door didn't open. It disintegrated. 200 pounds of steel swung by two officers who had calibrated exactly how much force this particular door frame required made contact just above the deadbolt. The hinges ripped from the frame on the first swing. Wood splintered along and across the grain, sending pieces 6 feet in every direction. The welcome mat flew inward and landed face down against the baseboard. Justice is not an accident. It lives here. Face down on the floor. 30 officers through a doorway, built for one person at a time. Flashlights mounted on rifles cutting in every direction, the beams crossing and separating and crossing again in the chaotic geometry of a forced entry. The shouting everywhere. Get on the ground. Get on the ground now. Don't move. Hands where I can see them. Vivien stood in her hallway in dark blue flannel pajamas. Small white stars on the fabric. Bare feet on the floor. She had sanded plank by plank 2 summers ago. Hands raised as high as she could. Raise them. Eyes blinking against the blinding white of a dozen flashlights aimed at her face. She couldn't see anything. Not faces, not badges. Only white light and dark shapes behind it moving fast. She opened her mouth. I am a federal. A hand closed on her left shoulder and spun her hard. Her balance went. A second hand hit her upper back, a flat, forceful shove, and the floor came up and she didn't brace in time. Knees, buckled palms hit hardwood. Then a hand at the back of her neck, putting her the rest of the way down, and her cheek pressed against the wood with a force that was not accidental. The knee came between her shoulder blades immediately. Her arms pulled behind her back. Cuffs clicked shut too tight already. Too tight, metal-biting skin before the sound of locking had finished. She felt it immediately, and said nothing about it immediately, because she was doing something else. She was breathing. Deliberately. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she had trained herself to breathe in the worst moments of the worst cases. When a verdict came back wrong. When evidence she relied on fell apart. When the law failed the person it was supposed to protect. You breathe. You stay present. You do not panic, because panic is information leaving your body that you need to keep. Her reading glasses had been knocked from her face when she went down. She heard them skitter, and then small, clean, decisive, the sound of a boot coming down on the left lens. A single clear note above the chaos. She turned her face slightly. 3 feet away. One lens whole. The other cracked from center to rim. She said in a voice she made steady word by deliberate word. You have the wrong address. This is 317. The warrant is for 315. Please check the warrant. A man crouched beside her. Spearmint gum. Close. Sweetheart, everybody on this block who ends up on this floor has got an explanation. Yours isn't special. He stood up, stepped over her. Fan out. Every room. If it's locked, break it. If it's sealed, cut it. I want every inch. They obeyed. The living room went first. 2 officers moving fast, then slower, with the methodical efficiency of people who had been trained to search and who had searched many rooms. Couch cushions pulled off, pressed for anything hidden, then slashed along their seams with a utility knife, because sometimes things were inside cushions. Books swept from shelves in armfuls, pages fanned, dropped. Framed photographs lifted from walls checked behind set face down in the growing debris. A decorative basket overturned a ball of yarn, a bookmark, a folded utility bill scattered across the rug. On the kitchen counter, a ceramic bowl, wide-mouthed, deep blue glaze painted with small orange fish that caught light differently depending on the angle. Vivienne's aunt had made it. 71 years old, 30 years of pottery, 9 years on that counter in the same spot. An officer's forearm caught its edge, sweeping the counter clean in one motion. It hit the tile and broke into 100 pieces that scattered 4 feet in every direction. The sound of it was sharp and complete and final. Vivien heard it from the hallway. She lay still and said nothing. In the bedroom, sheets pulled off in one motion and dropped in the corner. Closet opened. Clothes yanked from hangers in handfuls, and dropped boxes from the upper shelf pulled down and dumped. Shoes. A winter hat. A birthday card she had been keeping. Old tax returns. A shoebox of photographs from her law school graduation. Her swearing-in ceremony. Her 40th birthday party. All of it on the floor together, treated with the same level of care as a random pile of objects. Dresser drawers inverted over the carpet. Personal correspondence. Prescription bottles. Jewelry, a watch her mother had given her, earrings she wore to court, a thin gold chain she'd owned since she was 22. A boot stepped through them without pausing. They found nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no contraband of any kind. Not a single item that justified even one officer being in this house, let alone 30. Vivienne hadn't moved from the hallway floor. Her wrists had gone from red to purple. She told a passing officer the cuffs were too tight. He looked at her and kept walking. She told a second officer the same thing. "You'll get that addressed when we're done." Her left shoulder had begun to scream from the angle of her arms pinned behind her back. She breathed. She counted. She waited. The study off the hallway was where Vivien worked when she brought work home from Washington, which was most weekends. A desk, a floor-to-ceiling bookcase, a narrow window onto the side yard, her laptop on the nightstand in the bedroom plugged in, her briefcase on the desk chair, brown leather worn soft at the corners from 12 years of daily handling. An officer entered and opened the briefcase. Inside, 14 active case files from the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Federal investigative documents. Internal affairs complaint records from law enforcement agencies in 5 states obtained under federal subpoena. Witness protection information, names, locations, conditions for individuals who had agreed to provide testimony in exchange for federal shelter. The master investigation files. The working documents of an active federal civil rights enforcement operation. At the top of the stack, visible without moving anything, a folder tab in Vivienne's careful handwriting. Dellwood, PD. The officer flipped through the top 3 files with the incurious efficiency of someone cataloging rather than reading. He noted the official headers. He stacked the files back. "Got a lot of federal-looking paperwork in here, Lieutenant. Bunch of official headers. Bag it." Vivienne's voice came from the hallway, controlled, but sharper now, carrying the particular authority of someone who has moved from patience to precision. "Those are classified federal documents from the United States Department of Justice. The officer handling them is not authorized to access, remove, or examine them under any federal statute. You are in active violation of obstruction of justice. Every additional action compounds that violation." Pruitt appeared in his doorway. He looked at Vivien on the floor. He looked at the officer in the study. The particular look of a man who has decided that a complication is simply not a complication. "She wants to play lawyer," he said. "We'll play lawyer. Bag the files." In the bedroom, Officer Marsh found the laptop. Silver casing power cord plugged in. She opened it. Password screen. Standard DOJ encryption. "Laptop in here, Lieutenant. It's locked. Bring it." Vivienne's voice came back immediately, and this time, the composure had an edge. That laptop contains active federal investigation data. It contains the identities and locations of individuals under federal witness protection. If you remove that laptop, you are committing a federal crime. Those people, real people, could be placed in danger by that action. Marsh hesitated, stood in the doorway holding the laptop with both arms, looked toward the study, then at a middle distance that held no particular answer. Pruitt appeared at the end of the hallway. He looked at Marsh. He looked at Vivien on the floor. He said with perfect confidence and complete indifference, "She can tell it to the judge." He turned and walked back toward the living room. He had no idea what he just said. Marsh unplugged the laptop, tucked it under her arm, carried it out of the bedroom. 20 minutes in, nothing found. Pruitt stood in the center of Vivienne's living room and turned in a slow, deliberate circle. He was getting angry, not worried, not cautious. Angry, the specific anger of a man whose certainty has been confronted by evidence and has responded by doubling down on the certainty rather than reconsidering the evidence. His eyes swept the room, the bookshelves, the polished furniture, the framed art, the reading chair in the corner with the wall behind it. He turned away from the wall. He turned toward the younger officer stationed near the doorway. 26, 11 months in the unit, still learning the rules of this particular institution, and he lowered his voice to the register he used when he wanted something to sound like experience being passed down. "You know how many of these I've done? On this east side in 7 years?" He didn't wait for an answer. 43 operations. 43. You know what they all have in common. The young officer said nothing. Whoever's on the floor always has a story. Pruitt moved slowly back toward the hallway entrance, speaking loud enough for Vivien to hear every word. Always. The grandmother with the rosary beads who's holding for her nephew. The nursing student with the textbooks who's cutting product for her boyfriend. The deacon, the school teacher, the retired, whoever, they've all got the story ready before we even get through the door. I heard this one's claiming to be from the Justice Department. He let out a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I've had people claim to be senators. I've had people show me laminated cards they printed at the library. This one's got a better story than most, I'll give her that. But you look at this house. He gestured at the bookshelves, the furniture, the framed art. You look at everything in it. Nobody lives like this on a government salary, unless somebody bigger is taking very good care of them. She's holding for somebody with real weight behind them. We keep looking until we find it. The young officer shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. He said nothing. He had been in this unit long enough to understand the rules. Pruitt walked to where Vivien lay. He stood directly above her feet, planted on either side of her body, close enough that she could see the scuff marks on his boots from where she was. "Who do you work for?" "I work for the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." He snorted. "Right. And I work for the UN." He crouched, elbows on his knees. "Here's how this works, sweetheart. The longer you hold to this story, the longer you stay on that floor. The moment you give me something real, this ends. That's it. That's simple. I'm not holding a story. My credentials are on the wall directly behind you." He didn't turn around. He was standing 3 feet from the wall behind the reading chair, 3 feet from the federal appellate appointment signed by the President of the United States, 3 feet from the DOJ credential with the gold seal and her photograph, 3 feet from the FBI Director's commendation, 3 feet from the photograph of Vivienne Moss shaking hands with the United States Attorney General in the West Wing of the White House. He did not turn around, because Pruitt did not come to this house to investigate. He came to dominate. And men who come to dominate don't look at walls. They don't check addresses. They kick doors and manage scenes, and they find what they came to find, or they escalate until the weight of their presence justifies the operation retroactively. "Search the office," he said. "Pull everything." Across the street, the upstairs light in the yellow house at 318 Sycamore had come on at 6:03. Dara Simmons had been a school librarian for 26 years. She was 58 years old. She had lived on Sycamore Lane for 23 years and had watched the neighborhood policed in ways she had filed 3 complaints about, each returned with a form letter. She pulled the curtain aside and stopped breathing. An occupation. Not a raid. An occupation. Police vehicles from one end of the block to the other. Officers in body armor swarming around a house with rifles up. A helicopter so low she could feel the vibration in her window glass. Red and blue lights pulsing across every surface of every house on the block, in the relentless rhythm of emergency that never becomes ordinary, no matter how many times you've seen it, because some part of your brain registers it always as catastrophe. Then she saw which house. Not a stranger's house. Vivienne's house. The front door was gone. A ragged opening where it had been, wood splintered away from the frame on both sides, and through the gap in the beam of the exterior spotlight, she could see the hallway floor. She could see Vivien, her neighbor, her friend, the woman she waved to every evening without fail, face down on her own hardwood floor, hands behind her back. A man standing above her, with his boots planted on either side of her body, like he was claiming land. Dara whispered something that wasn't a word and wasn't a prayer, but lived between them. Then she grabbed her phone off the nightstand charger and came back to the window. Her hands were shaking. She could feel it in her fingers and her wrists and partway up her forearms. She opened the camera. She hit record. She had no plan beyond record. She only knew that what was happening across the street was happening, and the only response she had was to refuse to look away. So she stood there with her phone in both hands, and her hands shaking, and she did not look away. 4 doors down, Earl Watson had been on his porch since the helicopter woke him. 74 years old, 32 years carrying mail on eastern Dellwood's routes. He knew Sycamore Lane, the way you know a route you've walked in every season and every weather. He watched for 2 minutes. Then he walked inside and picked up his landline. The desk sergeant on duty at the 6th Precinct answered on the second ring. Dellwood Police Non-Emergency. Earl Watson's voice was 60 years of Mississippi unhurried resonant, carrying the authority of a man who had nothing to prove and no patience for being made to prove it. Son, I am calling from 322 Sycamore Lane. You have about 30 of your officers and a helicopter outside the home of Judge Vivienne Moss at 317. Whatever you think is happening over there, I need you to understand you have the wrong house. The desk sergeant's fingers stopped on his keyboard. I'm sorry. Did you say Judge Moss? I did. Vivienne Moss, former federal appellate judge, works for the Justice Department in Washington, lives at 317 Sycamore Lane, which is where your people are right now, breaking her house apart. Silence on the line. Not the brief silence of someone forming a response. The longer, heavier silence of someone running a rapid and terrible calculation and arriving at an answer they cannot change. The sergeant pulled up the active raid warrant. Target address 315 Sycamore Lane. The caller's address 317. 2 digits. 1 transposed address. 27 minutes of active operations at the wrong house. He didn't radio Pruitt. He didn't call the tactical team. He picked up the internal line and went straight to the top. Chief Roland Vickers's cell phone rang at 6:28 a.m. He answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with interrupted sleep and the reflexive irritation of a man whose Saturdays rarely started before 7. Vickers. Chief, it's Sergeant Dawson at the desk. Sir, I have a significant problem with the Sycamore Lane operation. What kind of problem? Sir, a breath. They hit the wrong house. Pause. The sound of a mattress adjusting. Someone sitting up fast. Which house are they at 317, sir? That's... Shorter pause. Heavier. I know whose house that is. The silence stretched. When Vickers spoke again, the sleep was completely gone from his voice. What replaced it was flat and cold. The voice of a man who has understood the dimensions of a disaster and is already calculating whether any part of it is recoverable. Nobody leaves that scene. Nobody removes anything else. Nobody talks to press. I am on my way right now. He hung up, threw on his uniform without buttoning it fully, and drove toward Sycamore Lane at a speed that had no relationship to the posted limit. 6:44 a.m. The black town car came down Sycamore Lane at twice the speed limit and braked at an angle across two patrol cars, tires cutting into the pavement. Chief Roland Vickers stepped out before the engine fully died. White mid-50s, the face of a man who had looked older than his age this week and was now looking older still. Uniform half-tucked, badge slightly crooked, unshaved. He looked the officers who watched him approach would later agree, like a man who had aged a decade in one car ride. He moved fast, past the patrol cars, past the SWAT trucks, past a cluster of officers near the command SUV standing around with coffee thermoses, the relaxed posture of people whose job for the moment was to wait. None of them saluted. None of them had time to read his face before he was past them. At the porch he stopped. The front door, the dark green door Vivien had chosen specifically, had installed on a Tuesday 3 years ago, because she'd wanted something solid was gone. A ragged, open frame, splintered wood attached to the jamb on both sides. Pieces of the door frame scattered across the welcome mat, which had been pushed against the baseboard, and now lay face down. The brass numbers 317 were right there, mounted on the porch post at chest height, catching the early morning light clearly and without ambiguity. Vickers stared at them. His jaw tightened so hard, a vein pulsed in his left temple. He stepped inside. Hallway scuff marks on the hardwood, shoe rack overturned. Vivien's reading glasses still on the floor, where they'd landed one lens whole. One lens spiderwebbed from center to rim. He moved into the living room. Couch cushions, 2 of them slashed on the floor. Books across the rug. The ceramic bowl in 100 pieces across the kitchen tile. A framed photograph face down in the debris. And then he saw the wall. It hit him in pieces, each one worse than the last. First, the Howard University law degree, framed in dark wood, the gold lettering still formal and exact. His steps slowed. Something in the back of his mind, professional recognition, accumulated knowledge of what certain credentials meant in certain rooms, began a process he hadn't yet consciously acknowledged. Then the FBI director's commendation. The letterhead, unmistakable. The text, readable from where he stood, used the words exceptional and federal civil rights investigation and indispensable contribution. He stopped walking. His hands, which had been moving slightly as he crossed the room, went still at his sides. Then the DOJ Senior Enforcement Counsel credential. Gold federal seal in the lower corner. A photograph. A woman in a dark blazer, direct gaze, the composed expression of someone photographed in an official capacity. A name in clean formal type. Vivienne Moss. And above it, United States Department of Justice. Civil Rights Division. His lips parted. No sound came out. Then the photograph. 8x10. Black frame. A woman standing in the West Wing of the White House, shaking hands with the United States Attorney General. Both of them were smiling, not a diplomatic half-smile, a real one caught mid-moment. Vickers stopped breathing. He stood at that photograph for a moment he would not be able to account for afterward. A moment where the only thing running in his mind was the arithmetic of everything that had just gone wrong, how far back it extended, how many layers it had, and whether any layer led somewhere that didn't end his career. He didn't move. He didn't look away. He stood at that photograph and felt the morning change permanently in his memory. Long enough for every officer in the room to understand what he was looking at. Long enough for the silence to mean something. Then, at the center of the wall, the place of highest honor, the thing she had framed above everything else, the Federal Appellate Court Appointment Certificate, the letterhead of the United States Court of Appeals, the language of appointment, and at the bottom two signatures, the Chief Justice and the President of the United States. Below them in formal type, Vivienne Moss, United States Court of Appeals, Fifth Circuit. Vickers' face went the color of paper. Not slowly, all at once, like something structural had given way behind it and taken everything with it. He stood in the silence for 3 more seconds. The helicopter was still circling outside. Its rotors thudded through the walls, steady, patient, indifferent to everything below. No other sound in the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The morning sat in the living room like a held breath, waiting to find out what it had become. Then he turned around. Pruitt was right behind him, coming from the hallway. Chest out, grinning the grin of a man arriving to deliver a satisfactory report to a superior who will appreciate it. He'd seen the chief's car and come to find him the way a subordinate comes to find a superior when things are proceeding according to plan, and there is performance to be acknowledged. "Chief, glad you're here. Got the place locked down, one suspect detained. She's been somewhat vocal, but we're nearly through the search, and we haven't located anything definitive yet, so I'm thinking we expand the, 'Where is she?' Not a question. A blade. 4 words with the weight of something very heavy placed down very precisely." Pruitt blinked. The grin recalibrated towards something more careful. "She's in the hallway, cuffed, secured. Take me to her. Now." Pruitt led Vickers around the corner. There she was, Vivienne Moss, former federal appellate judge, senior enforcement counsel of the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, face down on her own hardwood floor. Flannel pajamas, bare feet, wrists purple and swollen inside handcuffs, applied past any humane standard, the skin around the cuff edges already showing the deep red indentation of metal, held too tight for too long. A bruise darkening across her left cheekbone, where her face had been pressed against the floor for 32 minutes. Her cracked reading glasses, still 3 feet away, exactly where they had landed. Vickers' voice came out barely above a whisper. But in the silence of that hallway, where every officer had gone completely still, it carried to every corner. "Uncuff her. Right now." Pruitt tilted his head, the reflex of a man mid-operation, who has not yet been told the operation is over. "Chief, we haven't finished the uncuff her. Right now. Do not make me say it a 3rd time." Something in those 8 words moved Pruitt's hands before his brain finished the argument. He knelt, fumbled with his key, released the cuffs. The steel fell away. Deep red grooves in her skin. Nobody moved to help her up. She didn't wait for anyone to. Vivien pressed her palms flat against the hardwood floor. The floor she had sanded by hand over 3 weekends, 2 summers ago. Every plank starting at the front of the house and working toward the back. Her knees aching by the end of each day. The result, by the end of the 3rd weekend. Something she was quietly proud of. And she pushed herself up. Not quickly, not with the scrambling urgency of escape. Slowly. Deliberately. With the measured pace of a woman choosing exactly how she was going to rise. She came to her full height. 5 feet 8. The posture of someone who had spent 20 years standing in courtrooms before juries, before judges, before rooms full of people whose attention was not given, but earned. She rubbed her right wrist, then her left. Patient and thorough, working the circulation back into each hand separately. She rolled her left shoulder once the joint had been held at the wrong angle for too long and was announcing it. She let out one short, controlled breath. Then she bent down and picked up her reading glasses from the floor. She examined the cracked lens for a moment. She put the glasses on anyway. She looked through the spider-webbed lens without comment. Then she looked at Dale Pruitt. Not with anger, not with tears. With something that was in its way considerably worse than either the specific, deliberate, undistorted clarity of someone who has been cataloging information for 32 minutes on a floor and who now has everything she needs and is prepared to begin. Something moved in her eyes in that moment, something private, something that was entirely hers. The recognition that the man standing in front of her had handed her everything, that the morning had built its own case, without her having to build it, that the only thing left was to speak. She knew exactly what she was about to do to him, and she let herself know it for exactly 1 second before she began. When she spoke, her voice was level, every word placed with the care and intention of a trial attorney who understood that everything said in this hallway in this moment was a record that would exist long after everyone present had left. Sergeant. She was looking at Pruitt, only at Pruitt. I am Senior Enforcement Counsel, Vivienne Moss, of the United States Department of Justice, Office of Civil Rights. I am a former federal appellate judge of the United States Court of Appeals, Fifth Circuit, appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate. She paused. Let it settle. The way you let a piece of evidence settle in a courtroom enough time for every person in the room to process it fully, to feel the weight of it, to understand where it was going. You and your officers entered my home without verifying the address on your warrant. The warrant address is 315 Sycamore Lane. This address is 317. The brass house numbers have been mounted on my front porch post since this house was built. You entered anyway. Another pause. Shorter. You assaulted me. You restrained me for 32 minutes without presenting a warrant, without reading me my rights, and without any lawful justification whatsoever. Your officers seized 14 active federal case files containing classified investigative materials. Your officer removed a laptop containing the identities and locations of individuals under federal witness protection. The hallway was so quiet, you could hear the helicopter still circling above. Patient steady its rotors, a low metronome over a scene that had already resolved into something none of them could walk back from. Every action taken in this house by you and your 30 officers is now a federal matter. I am telling you this clearly and in front of witnesses. Every single one of you will answer for it. Pruitt's mouth had opened at some point. Nothing came out. His face had gone white. The gum in his jaw had stopped moving entirely. His hands hung at his sides with the limp, absent quality of objects that had been set down and forgotten. Behind him, Sandra Marsh, who was still holding the laptop she had unplugged from the bedroom nightstand, quietly set it down on the nearest surface. She took 2 steps back, then 1 more until her back was against the wall. Vickers was not looking at Vivien. He was looking at the floor. The face of a man doing arithmetic. He already knows the answer to running it again, because the mind confronted with the full scale of a disaster will check the math 1 more time in case the number comes out different. It didn't come out different. Vivien turned away from both of them. She moved to the hallway table where her cell phone had been knocked sideways during the breach and had remained there untouched. She picked it up. Screen lit. She went to her contacts and found the number without looking for it. Second entry under recent calls, a Washington number she had dialed hundreds of times. She pressed call. Once. Twice. A voice answered, sleep-rough, unhappy about the hour, but present in the way of people who have trained themselves to be present at any hour when a certain kind of call comes. Vivien. It's not 6:30. What? She said 3 words. It happened to me. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, something shifted on the other end of the line that she could hear even through the phone's small speaker. The specific quality of a mind moving from waking up to fully operational. The recalibration of a person who has just understood what kind of morning it is. Deputy Attorney General Marcus Holden's voice, when it came back, was flat and sharp and all the way awake. I'm activating the Civil Rights Division. Full response. Don't let anyone leave that scene, Vivien. Not one person. Understood. She hung up. Set the phone down on the hallway table with a care that was almost gentle. Turned around. She looked at Dale Pruitt and Roland Vickers, standing in the wreckage of the morning they had made. She said nothing else. She had said what needed to be said. The machinery she had set in motion with 3 words would say the rest in rooms and courtrooms and on podiums in Washington for a very long time. The silence after the call stretched to 10 seconds. Then beyond. Pruitt was the first to attempt something. Chief, listen. The tip was solid, credible source. The informant had given us reliable intelligence. Before this was a good faith operation based on good faith. Vickers turned on him, and his voice, which had been flat and cold, now shook with a barely controlled tremor. You brought 30 officers, a helicopter, a battering ram. You put a federal judge face down on her own floor for over 30 minutes. Your people seized classified DOJ documents and removed a laptop containing federal witness identities. And you want to stand here and tell me about good faith? We didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't check. Vickers stepped closer. You did not check the house number. You did not verify the address. You did not read the warrant twice, which is the single most basic step in the single most basic procedure for a search operation. You came here because this is what you do. You come in force and deal with consequences later. And for 7 years, I let you. And this morning is what that looks like. He stopped. Voice dropped back to flat. Badge. Weapon. Give them to me now. The hallway had never been quieter. Every officer within sight had gone completely still. Not the tactical stillness of training, but the frozen stillness of people witnessing something they will describe for the rest of their careers and who have not yet fully processed that they are inside it, rather than watching from a distance. Dale Pruitt stood in front of Chief Roland Vickers. His expression moved through several things in rapid succession: the reflex of argument, the impulse to negotiate, the flinch of a man who has always had the weight of the department behind him and has just felt it removed, and then with the deliberate, careful movements of someone doing something irreversible and understanding that it is irreversible. He unclipped his badge from his belt. He held it for a moment. The metal caught the hallway light. Then he set it on the hallway table, beside Vivien's phone. He drew his service weapon, ejected the magazine, placed both on the table. His hands were trembling. He was trying not to show it. He was not succeeding. Vickers turned to Sandra Marsh. She was pressed against the wall. Eyes of someone who has been running the arithmetic of the last 3 years of her career and arriving at the same answer every time. You too, Officer Marsh. Sir, I was following Lieutenant Pruitt's procedure for a tactical badge and weapon, Marsh. Don't make me ask again. She surrendered them. Set them on the table without looking at them. By 7:20 a.m., 3 additional officers, those most directly involved in the physical restraint and the handling of the federal documents, had also been suspended pending investigation. All 5 escorted out one by one. Pruitt walked out last, through the destroyed doorway, the same one he had stood behind 90 minutes earlier, with a megaphone, certain of what he was about to find. Now he walked through it with his head down and his hands empty, stripped of the badge and the weapon and the authority that had made him feel, for 7 years, that the world inside these neighborhoods was his to manage as he saw fit. The neighbors had come out onto their porches, a dozen, maybe more, in the early morning light that was now pale gold, watching in silence as the man who had treated their neighborhood like occupied territory walked in the opposite direction toward a cruiser, toward consequences, 7 years in the making, that had always been heading to this particular morning on this particular block. Nobody said a word to him. They didn't need to. Chapter 17. The video and the image. Dara Simmons had been recording for 24 minutes. Her hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the 14-minute mark, not because the feeling had gone, but because it had moved somewhere deeper. And what replaced the shaking was a steadiness she would not have known to call courage. If someone hadn't told her afterward, that was what it was. She had captured everything. The convoy arriving, the breach, the officers streaming in, the SWAT trucks, the helicopter, the broken door, and through the doorway in the beam of the exterior lights, Vivien face down on her own floor, while an officer stood above her and the search of her home continued around her. 24 minutes. Her phone battery had been at 31% by the end. She hadn't stopped to charge it. She hadn't lowered the camera. She hadn't looked away. By 9 a.m., the footage had reached an investigative reporter at the Dellwood Courier-Tribune through Dara's nephew, who had watched from the street below and understood immediately what he was looking at. By noon, it was on the website. By 3 p.m., 3 state news organizations had it. By evening, the Associated Press. By midnight, it had gone national. The footage was devastating, in the way that footage is devastating when what it documents is not ambiguous. A black woman in sleep clothes, handcuffed face down on her own floor. 30 armed officers in body armor. SWAT trucks on a residential street. A battering ram, a helicopter, and a dark green front door that was solid and whole at 6:04 and gone at 6:06. One caption shared across every platform in an infinite loop of furious reposting. She was a federal judge. They didn't check the address. One frame out of 24 minutes burned hotter than everything else. Vivienne's reading glasses on the hallway floor. Cracked lens. Lying in the debris of the search, scattered books pulled drawers, the pieces of the ceramic bowl that had rolled from the kitchen. One small artifact of something that should not have happened, and that no official language would make into something other than what it was. That image ended up on protest signs within 48 hours, on the cover of 2 national magazines within 2 weeks, on late-night television, on the congressional record. It said everything that 24 minutes of footage said in a single frame, without a caption, without anything except the visual truth of a woman's broken glasses on the floor of her own home. Chief Roland Vickers held a press conference at Dellwood City Hall on Saturday afternoon. Uniform pressed, badge straight. He read from a prepared statement. He used the phrase isolated procedural incident in the 3rd sentence. A reporter cut him off before the 4th. Chief Vickers, you deployed 30 officers, 2 SWAT trucks, and a helicopter to the home of a federal judge on an unverified anonymous tip. In what sense is that procedural? Vickers gripped the podium. Our protocols are currently under, was Judge Moss. Read her rights at any point during the 32 minutes she was on the floor. That question is part of the ongoing. Did any officer on scene verify the house number before the breach? Sweat was visible on his forehead. He had no answers. He stood at the podium in front of the cameras and the people who had come to stand outside City Hall on a Saturday afternoon, because what had happened on Sycamore Lane required a witness, and he had nothing. Monday morning. 48 hours after the front door of 317 Sycamore Lane came off its hinges, Deputy Attorney General Marcus Holden stood at the DOJ's primary press briefing room in Washington, D.C., the federal seal behind him, American flags on either side, 50 cameras in front of him, because this had become in 48 hours the kind of story that crossed borders. He did not read from notes. On Saturday morning at approximately 6:05 a.m. local time, 30 officers of the Dellwood, Mississippi Police Department executed a forced entry into the private residence of a senior official of the United States Department of Justice at an address that did not match the address specified on their warrant. The official, a former federal appellate judge and current senior enforcement counsel of the Civil Rights Division, was physically restrained, without probable cause, for 32 minutes. She was not presented with the warrant. Her constitutional rights were not read to her at any point during the incident. Classified federal investigative materials were unlawfully seized. A laptop containing federal witness protection data was removed from the premises. He paused, looked directly into the cameras. Effective immediately, the Department of Justice is opening a full federal investigation into the Dellwood Police Department. This investigation will encompass Saturday's incident in its entirety. It will also encompass the department's broader enforcement practices, specifically the documented pattern of civil rights violations in the Sycamore Hill neighborhood and surrounding areas that have generated formal complaints over multiple years. This is not a review. This is an investigation. There is a difference, and this department intends to demonstrate what that difference looks like. He turned and walked off the stage without taking a single question. Federal investigators were in Dellwood before the week ended. What the investigators found in Dellwood was not a surprise to the people who had been living in Sycamore Hill. It was not a surprise to anyone who had filed a complaint and received a form letter. Anyone who had driven a car that looked too new and spent the next 40 minutes on a shoulder explaining themselves to an officer who hadn't found anything but wasn't ready to acknowledge it. Anyone who had sat at a kitchen table and written down carefully what had been done to them and sent it through proper channels and received in return a letter that said no evidence of misconduct found. What it was for the investigators was a record, and records assembled with subpoena authority and the patient methodology of people trained to find things that have been deliberately hidden tell a story that individual complaints dispersed, isolated, buried cannot. Dale Pruitt's service record was the center of it. 11 incidents over 7 years. 11 operations in predominantly black neighborhoods on Dellwood's eastern side. Wrong address entries, excessive force, unlawful detainment. 11 formal complaints filed by 11 families who had gone through the process of documentation and submission with the belief, or at least the hope, that the process meant something. 11 complaints processed by the Dellwood PD Internal Affairs Division, reviewed and quietly closed with findings of no procedural misconduct. The investigators went through them one by one. A family on Birchwood Avenue. Door broken down in 2020. Wrong house. The tip was for next door. No drugs found. An 11-year-old child on the living room floor for 9 minutes before anyone explained what was happening. Complaint filed. Closed, no misconduct. A 22-year-old nursing student. Pulled from her car in 2021. No moving violation. No equipment violation. Searched without consent. Nothing found. Complaint filed. Closed, no misconduct. A 67-year-old deacon handcuffed in his own kitchen during a 2023 search. Wrong floor. The warrant was for 4B, not 4D. Held for 40 minutes. Nothing found. Released without explanation. Complaint filed. Closed, no misconduct. 11 families. 11 complaints. 11 closures. Then the investigators found the internal emails. Department communications pulled under subpoena showed a culture that bore no relationship to stated policy and every relationship to what had happened on Sycamore Lane. One email from a unit commander referred to a formal complaint from a Birchwood Flats resident as another one for the circular. The attachment was the complaint form. The file path where it was stored led to a folder labeled Circular File Department, slang for the trash. They found the deployment records. In 18 months prior to the raid, Pruitt's unit had executed 7 similar operations in black neighborhoods: heavy tactical deployment, helicopter support, or K-9 battering ram. In the same period, 2 similar tips had come in from predominantly white neighborhoods on the city's north side, both handled by 2 officer teams. One resulted in a knock on the door. One was assessed as insufficiently credible and closed. No battering rams, no helicopters, no 30 officers before dawn, the same category of tip. 2 entirely different responses determined entirely by where the address was located. Officer Sandra Marsh did not wait for the indictment. She contacted the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility within 10 days of the raid, offering full cooperation in exchange for consideration at sentencing. Her testimony, delivered over 3 days in a federal conference room in Jackson, covered everything: how Pruitt selected targets, how address verification had been treated as optional for years, how officers understood that commendations and operational opportunities came from compliance, not caution, how complaints from Sycamore Hill residents were discussed in briefing rooms in terms she declined to repeat in the formal record, but which the investigators already had in 2 separate emails. Her most quoted line became national news before the week was out. We knew. All of us knew. Nobody ever stopped it. Chief Vickers tried to survive the weeks that followed. 3 more press conferences, an internal review, 2 additional supervisory officers suspended, an outside audit commissioned. Each action was reported against the background of everything the federal investigators were finding, and the contrast between what Vickers said publicly and what his department's records showed made every subsequent press conference worse than the one before it. The investigation revealed that Vickers had personally received 8 formal complaints regarding Pruitt's conduct over 4 years. His signature appeared on 7 of the 8 internal affairs closure letters. His isolated incident statement was played by every news organization in the country, side by side, with the evidence of 11 prior incidents. The Dellwood City Council convened an emergency session. The vote to demand Vickers' resignation was unanimous, every member, including 2 who had been photographed with him at department commendation ceremonies in each of the previous 2 years. He resisted for 4 days. On the 5th day, city marshals escorted him from the building. A formal public apology to Vivienne Moss and the Sycamore Hill community was read by the mayor on the steps of City Hall. Some council members were crying. Whether the tears were for Vivien, or for the situation, or for themselves, was a question the neighborhood discussed without reaching consensus. The federal grand jury returned its findings 6 weeks after the raid. The charges against Dale Pruitt were read into the official record in a Jackson federal courtroom, with the flat cadence of legal language that renders horror administrative without diminishing it violation of civil rights under color of law: unlawful search and seizure, destruction of property, mishandling of classified federal documents, filing a false operational report because Pruitt had listed the target address as confirmed in his pre-raid paperwork, when it had never been verified by any officer at any point in the operation. Maximum combined sentence: 18 years federal prison. Outside the courthouse, Pruitt told reporters he was a good officer who had made an honest mistake. He stood in a suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders and said the words with the conviction of someone who had said them enough times they had begun to feel true. The reporters who had covered Sycamore Lane since Saturday evaluated the statement against the 11 prior complaints, the internal emails, the deployment records, the testimony of his own subordinate. They wrote what they wrote. Nobody bought it. Not anymore. Marsh did not fight. She entered a plea agreement, surrendered her law enforcement certification, and cooperated through the trial. She would never serve as a law enforcement officer anywhere in the United States again. 3 years of choices made within a culture she had understood and accepted had cost her everything she had built. Vickers moved out of state. No law enforcement agency would hire him. No firm that understood what his name meant retained him. His name became, in the quiet way specific names sometimes do, a reference point, a case study cited in policy discussions and training materials about what leadership failure looks like when it compounds for long enough without consequence. Pruitt's trial ran 8 days in a Jackson courtroom that was not large enough for everyone who wanted to be there. He showed no remorse. He sat at the defense table in the careful posture of a man instructed by his attorney to project calm confidence, and he maintained it through the testimony of officers who had served with him for years, through the playing of Dara Simmons's footage, through the reading into evidence of his own words, from his own incident reports and his own emails. His defense argued three things: good faith reliance on credible intelligence, an honest administrative address error, and deployment scale consistent with standard department practice for this classification of operation. The prosecution spent 8 days demonstrating that none of these three things was supported by the evidence. They showed he never verified the address. They showed 11 prior incidents, establishing not isolated error, but a practice of deliberate disregard. They showed through deployment records that 30 officers and aerial support were assigned to Sycamore Lane, not because the intelligence warranted it, but because Sycamore Hill was where Pruitt's unit deployed 30 officers and aerial support. They played Dara Simmons's footage. All 24 minutes, in the particular silence of a courtroom, where everyone present understood what they were watching. When the footage ended, Vivien rising from the floor, cracked glasses, Pruitt escorted out the courtroom, stayed silent for several seconds before the judge called the next witness. They played the audio. Pruitt's own voice captured by the operational recording he had initiated at the start of the operation, saying "sweetheart" to a woman lying face down in handcuffs, saying "everybody on this block who ends up on this floor has got an explanation," saying "this place is too nice for this block," saying in reference to classified federal documents his officer was about to bag, "she can tell it to the judge." The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Guilty. All counts. Sentencing 2 weeks later. Courtroom packed. Vivien sat in the third row. Dark blue suit. New reading glasses, same frames, both lenses intact and uncracked. Hands folded in her lap. The sentencing judge, who had known Vivien professionally for over a decade, sentenced Dale Pruitt to 14 years in a federal corrections facility. The courtroom erupted. Applause tears 30 people, reaching for phones simultaneously. Pruitt's attorney put a hand on his shoulder. Pruitt stared at the table in front of him and did not react. Vivien did not applaud. She sat with her hands still folded and closed her eyes for a long moment that was entirely hers. Then she opened them. She stood up. She walked out of the courtroom. Outside, sunlight hit her face. Cameras flashed from a dozen directions. Reporters shouted questions over each other. She didn't answer a single one. She walked down the courthouse steps at a pace that was not hurried and not slow, got into a waiting car, and the door closed, and she was gone. The federal consent decree arrived 60 days after the indictment. Mandatory body cameras for every officer on every shift, footage retained and subject to external review. An independent civilian oversight board with genuine investigative authority, including subpoena power, rather than the advisory-only status of the previous board, which had met quarterly issued non-binding recommendations and been consistently ignored. Mandatory de-escalation training quarterly rather than annual, with competency assessments that carried consequences for failure. Address verification, requiring confirmation by 2 officers before any warrant was executed, documented in writing before the operation began. Proportionality requirements mandating deployment scale be justified by specific intelligence rather than neighborhood demographics. Community review panels with real authority over use of force complaints. The department that had rolled into Sycamore Hill before sunrise on a Saturday was being rebuilt from the foundation up. Individual consequences stated without ceremony. Dale Pruitt, 14 years. Appeals filed and denied twice. Pension revoked. His wife filed for divorce 8 weeks after sentencing. The house sold to cover legal fees. Sandra Marsh law enforcement certification permanently revoked. 3 years of choices made within a culture she had understood and accepted had cost her the career. Roland Vickers escorted out by marshals. No department hired him. No firm touched him. His name became a textbook case in what happens when leadership chooses silence over accountability for long enough. Dara Simmons still lived in the yellow house at 318. Sycamore Lane wind chimes on the porch, knocking together in a particular key whenever the weather was shifting. The woman who had grabbed her phone with shaking hands at 6 in the morning and stood at her window for 24 minutes, that woman had become, in the months after the raid, something she had not sought and did not particularly want to be. People called her brave. She corrected them each time with patient persistence. She had not been brave. Brave was what you were when you did something in the face of fear that threatened you. She had not been threatened that morning. Vivien had been threatened. The 11 families who had filed complaints over 7 years and received form letters had been threatened. Dara had stood at a window with a phone. "I didn't do anything brave," she said, at the community events and journalism panels and advocacy gatherings, where someone always wanted to put her at a table and hand her a microphone. "I just didn't look away." She and Vivien still waved to each other every evening across Sycamore Lane, the same wave they had exchanged every evening for 12 years, unchanged in its rhythm and ease. Some nights they sat on their respective porches and called something across the street. Some nights they met in the middle and talked for a while, or sat together with tea and said nothing at all. Some things between neighbors who have been through something together don't need to be spoken. They're just there in the air between two porches in the particular quiet of an evening on a block that is finally beginning to rest. 3 months after the verdict, a contractor arrived at 317 Sycamore Lane on a Tuesday morning and spent 4 hours installing a new front door. Solid oak, heavier than the one that had been taken off its hinges by a battering ram. Same dark green. The contractor had been given specific instructions. The kind of door that required real force to move, not because Vivien expected to need it, but because the old door should never have needed to be as strong as it was. And it still wasn't strong enough. And the new door was going to be stronger. And that was going to be true, because she wanted it to be true. She stood on the porch and watched him work. When he finished lock cycling smoothly, hinges silent, the door closing, with the particular dense, final sound of solid material settling into a solid frame, she ran her hand across the wood. Smooth, warm from the afternoon sun. She reached into the canvas bag she had brought outside and removed a small brass plaque 4 inches wide. She screwed it into the wall beside the new door herself. 2 screws. A Phillips head driver she had owned for 15 years. 3 minutes. Justice is not an accident. It lives here. She stepped back and looked at it. The original welcome mat had said something similar. She still had it. She had folded it and kept it because she did not throw away things that were still true just because something had happened to them. But the plaque was different from the mat. It was permanent. It was attached to the structure of the house itself. It said the same thing but in a way that required more than a battering ram to remove. Vivienne Moss did not sell the brownstone, did not apply for a transfer to a DOJ regional office in another city, though the offer was made quietly and with genuine care by people who understood what it meant to have your home violated and who thought she might want distance from the place where it happened. She did not want distance. Sycamore Hill was her home. She had known it for 12 years. Its blocks, its porches, its rhythms, its names. She had chosen it deliberately when choosing had been hard, and she was not going to be driven from it by the mourning that had been inflicted on it or on her. She went back to work at the Department of Justice within 3 weeks of the verdict. She sat down. She put her reading glasses on. She opened the files. But something had shifted in how she read them. Before the complaints had been what they were, documented injustices, pattern evidence, the raw material of a civil rights enforcement operation conducted from a professional distance by someone whose job was to see the pattern clearly and act on it with precision. She had been good at that. She had believed genuinely and consistently that she understood what was in those files. Now she understood differently. She had felt the hardwood against her cheek. She had felt the metal of the handcuffs too tight before the clicking stopped. She had heard the sound of her aunt's ceramic bowl breaking in her kitchen. She had lain on her own floor and been called sweetheart by a man who was certain all the way to the bottom of his certainty that she was nobody. She knew what was in those complaint files now. Not as a lawyer, as a woman who had been on the floor. She used every ounce of it. 6 months after the verdict, Vivienne Moss testified before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Police Reform. Standing room only from the moment the doors opened. Senators leaning forward. Staff members lining the walls. In the gallery packed to capacity, people who had made the trip to Washington from Mississippi, from Alabama, from Georgia, from Louisiana. People who had filed complaints and received form letters. People who had been on floors. People who had been called names by men with badges. People who had wanted for a long time to be in a room where someone was saying out loud and on the record what everyone in that room already knew. Vivien spoke for 9 minutes. No notes, no prepared text. Only a glass of water she didn't touch, and her hands folded on the table, and the reading glasses with both lenses intact. Her opening line, 9 words delivered in the level, precise voice of a woman who had chosen every syllable, made every front page in the country the next morning. I had credentials on my wall. Most people don't. The law must protect them just the same. That line traveled, printed on T-shirts, quoted in law school classrooms, read into the congressional record as part of the formal testimony transcript, appearing in op-eds and sermons, and in the remarks of senators who introduced reform legislation in the months that followed, translated into 7 languages. The kind of sentence that once said, belongs to everyone who needs it, which turned out to be a great many people. Vivien had not said it for herself, and she was honest about that. She had credentials on her wall. She had been by every formal measure exactly the kind of person the law was built to protect, and the law had failed her anyway, and that was a story worth telling. But the larger story, the 11 buried complaints, the 11 families, the grandmother, whose complaint had been filed in a folder called Circular, that was the story she was there to tell. Hers was the doorway. The other stories were what the doorway led to. She sat in the hearing room in Washington with the senators leaning forward, and 9 minutes already behind her, and the work continuing, the files on the desk. The cases in progress, the door at 317. Sycamore Lane standing solid and permanent with a plaque beside it. And she thought, this is what it looks like when a morning that was supposed to break you becomes the thing you use. She thought, I have been building cases my entire adult life. This is just the one I didn't expect to be building from a floor. She went home to Sycamore Lane. She sat down at her kitchen table. She put her reading glasses on. She opened a new case file. Outside, the evening light came down warm and long across the block. Across the street, Dara Simmons stepped out onto her porch. The wind chimes moved. She looked across the lane. She raised her hand. Vivien, visible through the kitchen window, raised hers back. The same wave, every evening. The particular ease of 2 women who had chosen the same block and were glad still of each other's presence on it. The new front door stood solid in its frame, warm from the afternoon sun, the brass plaque catching the last of the light. Justice is not an accident. It lives here. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, dignity, and the quiet refusal to break.